August 6, 1945, 8:15 in the morning. A single American aircraft drops a single bomb over the city of Hiroshima. 70,000 people die in the next few seconds. Another 70,000 will die from radiation in the weeks and months that follow. 3 days later, a second bomb falls on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito speaks on the radio for the first time in his life. The Japanese people hear their emperor's voice for the first time. He tells them the war has ended. The world looks at the two bombs and draws a conclusion that has been taught in history classrooms for 80 years. The atomic bomb ended the war. Japan surrendered because of the atomic bomb. This conclusion is wrong. Not completely wrong. The bombs were real. The destruction was real. The shock to Japanese leadership was real. But the conclusion mistakes the final blow for the reason for the defeat. It mistakes the moment of surrender for the cause of the loss. Japan had already lost the war before the first bomb fell on Hiroshima. It had lost it mathematically, industrially, logistically, and strategically. The atomic bombs did not defeat Japan. They accelerated a surrender that was coming anyway, on a timeline that historians still debate, but that the evidence strongly suggests was measured in months rather than years. The real reason Japan lost the Second World War is a story that begins not in August 1945, but in December 1941, not with a Japanese defeat, but with the moment of Japan's greatest triumph. And the reason Japan lost is the same reason it attacked Pearl Harbor in the first place. Oil. Hold that thought. Because to understand why oil determined the outcome of the Pacific War, you need to understand something about Japan's strategic position that the standard history of the war consistently underemphasizes. Japan in 1941 was an empire without the resources to sustain itself as an empire. It had no domestic oil. None. Every drop of fuel that powered its navy, its air force, its army, its factories came from outside Japan. In 1941, approximately 80% of that fuel came from the United States. When America imposed an oil embargo in July 1941, Japan's military leadership calculated it had approximately 18 months of reserves. The Pearl Harbor attack was not an act of aggression in the conventional sense. It was a resource acquisition mission with a military precondition. Japan needed the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia. The American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was the only force capable of preventing Japan from taking those oil fields. Destroy the fleet, take the oil fields, and Japan would have the energy independence that its empire required. The plan worked in its opening phase. Pearl Harbor succeeded tactically. The American battleships were sunk or damaged. The Dutch East Indies were seized. The oil fields came under Japanese control by March 1942. But the plan contained a fatal assumption that its architects had identified and had been unable to resolve. The assumption was that America would negotiate rather than fight a long war. Admiral Yamamoto, who designed the Pearl Harbor attack, had told the Japanese government before the war began that he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but after that he had no confidence whatsoever. He was asked to attack anyway. What Yamamoto understood, and what the Japanese government understood but could not accept as a reason not to act, was this. Japan and America were not comparable in industrial capacity. The United States produced approximately 12 times as much steel as Japan. It produced approximately 80 times as much oil. Its manufacturing base, its raw material access, its agricultural capacity, its geographic security. Every measurable factor of industrial war-making capacity favored America by margins that no military strategy, however brilliant, could overcome in a long war. Japan could win a short war. It could deliver blows fast enough and painful enough that America would accept a negotiated settlement that recognized Japanese control of the Western Pacific. It could not win a long war. In a long war, American production would eventually overwhelm Japanese military capability regardless of tactical outcomes in individual battles. Yamamoto knew this. He designed Pearl Harbor to win a short war. When the short war did not materialize, when America chose to fight rather than negotiate, the outcome became a matter of time and production. The time was measured in years. The production was always going to be decisive. Now, the second thing, the aircraft carriers. On December 7, 1941, When Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, the three most important ships in the American Pacific Fleet were not at Pearl Harbor. The Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga were at sea on other missions. The battleships Japan sank were already becoming obsolete as naval weapons. The war Japan had just started was going to be decided by aircraft carriers. The three carriers that survived Pearl Harbor will be the foundation of the American naval response. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, those carriers found their opportunity. Japanese naval intelligence had identified Midway Atoll as the next American defensive position and was planning an attack designed to draw the remaining American carriers into a battle where they could be destroyed. American codebreakers read the Japanese plan. The American carriers were waiting where Japan did not expect them. In 4 days of fighting, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, 4 ships that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, were sunk. More importantly, the experienced pilots who flew from those carriers, men who had been trained for years and who represented irreplaceable expertise, died with their ships in numbers that Japan's pilot training program could not quickly replace. Yamamoto had predicted he could run wild for 6 months. He was right to the month. Midway was June 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Japan never conducted a major offensive naval operation after Midway. The war that designed to last 6 months and end in a negotiated settlement had produced exactly what Yamamoto had predicted would happen if it lasted longer. The production gap between Japan and America was beginning to express itself in the number of ships and aircraft available on each side. That gap would only widen. Now the third reason Japan lost. The reason that military histories of the Pacific War underemphasize, because it is not as dramatic as carrier battles and island assaults. Submarines, American submarines in the Pacific, conducted one of the most effective campaigns of economic warfare in the history of naval conflict. By 1944 and 1945, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant shipping faster than Japan could build replacement vessels. This mattered for the same reason that the oil embargo of 1941 had mattered. Japan was an island nation dependent on imports for survival. Food, raw materials, oil, ammunition, everything the Japanese war economy needed moved by ship. The sea lanes connecting Japan to its conquered territories in Southeast Asia were the arteries of the Japanese imperial system. American submarines were severing those arteries. By 1944, Japan was importing approximately 30% of what it had imported in 1941. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the prize Japan had gone to war to capture, were producing oil. But the tankers that were supposed to move that oil to Japan were being sunk before they arrived. The oil Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor to secure was sitting in Indonesian ports while Japanese tankers burned in the Pacific. By the spring of 1945, the situation had become surreal in its severity. Japan had oil in the south. Japan had refineries in the home islands. The tankers connecting them were gone. Aircraft were grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Ships could not leave port. The industrial infrastructure that Japan had spent decades building was starving for the one resource it fought a war to secure. Japan had won the oil. It had lost the ships that moved the oil. The victory had been made irrelevant by the loss. The fourth reason is the one that produced the atomic bombs. The American air campaign against the Japanese home islands, conducted by B-29 bombers operating from captured Pacific islands, was by March 1945 systematically destroying Japanese cities. The bombing campaign did not use atomic weapons until August. Before Hiroshima, American B-29s had been burning Japanese cities with conventional incendiary bombs at a rate and on a scale that produced casualties comparable to the atomic attacks. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, killed approximately 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. 16 square miles of the city burned. The attack was repeated against Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of other Japanese cities through the spring and summer of 1945. By August 1945, when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, approximately 60 of Japan's largest cities had been substantially destroyed by conventional bombing. Japan's industrial capacity had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war level. Its civilian population was experiencing food shortages that in some regions approached famine conditions. Its military was being equipped at levels that could not sustain continued resistance. The atomic bombs did not introduce destruction to Japan. They concentrated destruction of unprecedented magnitude in a single weapon and a single moment. They were psychologically and politically significant. They were not strategically decisive in a context where 60 cities had already been destroyed. The Soviet declaration of war on Japan on August 8, 1945, 2 days after Hiroshima, 1 day before Nagasaki, was, by the assessment of several historians who have studied the Japanese decision to surrender, at least as significant as the atomic bombs in producing the final Japanese decision. Soviet entry into the war meant Japan could no longer hope to use the Soviet Union as an intermediary for negotiated peace terms with the United States. Japan had been attempting, through diplomatic channels, to encourage Soviet mediation that might produce a negotiated end to the war on terms that preserved the imperial system. When the Soviet Union declared war and Soviet forces invaded Manchuria, destroying the Japanese Guangdong Army in days, that hope ended. Japan was now at war with both the United States and the Soviet Union simultaneously. With its cities destroyed, its sea lanes cut, its oil supplies severed, its aircraft grounded, its army in the home island preparing to resist an invasion with bamboo spears and the bodies of its civilian population, the emperor intervened. Hirohito, whose role in the war's conduct has been debated by historians since 1945 with conclusions that range from active planner to passive symbol, broke the deadlock in the Japanese Supreme War Council that had been unable to reach a unanimous decision on surrender. He said the war must end. The council accepted his decision. On August 15th, his voice came over the radio. The people heard it for the first time. The accent was so formal, the language so archaic, that many listeners could not fully understand what he was saying. The meaning became clear through context and through the public announcements that followed. The war was over. Japan had not been defeated by a single weapon. It had been defeated by the collision of its strategic impossibility with American industrial capacity. The atomic bombs were the final expression of that collision, the most dramatic possible demonstration of the manufacturing gap between a country that could produce atomic weapons and a country whose tankers were being sunk faster than they could be built. Now, the question that the atomic bomb narrative obscures: was the war inevitable? Not the war that happened, the strategic outcome. Japan entered the Pacific War in December 1941 with approximately 18 months of oil reserves and a plan that required American willingness to negotiate before those reserves ran out. The plan had one fatal dependency. America had to choose peace over a long war. It did not choose peace. The moment America chose war, the outcome was determined by industrial capacity. Industrial capacity was never going to favor Japan. The decision to fight was a decision to lose. The timing was uncertain. The outcome was not. What the Japanese leadership could not accept in 1941 was not the military analysis. They had military analysts who told them what the numbers said. What they could not accept was a political and psychological reality that the analysis implied. They chose defeat. They did not expect it to feel like what it felt like. They expected a short war, a favorable negotiation, an outcome that preserved Japanese dignity and some portion of the imperial project. The Americans did not negotiate. The long war that Yamamoto had predicted would be decisive came. The production gap that the Japanese analysts had identified expressed itself in ships and aircraft and bombs, and finally in 2 cities reduced to ash by weapons that a country without adequate steel and oil could not have built. Japan surrendered, not because of 2 bombs, because of 4 years of a war that had always been statistically unlikely to win against an opponent that had chosen to fight rather than negotiate. The atomic bomb is the ending of the story. The industrial capacity gap is the story. The men who made the decision in December 1941 to attack Pearl Harbor were not wrong about their tactical situation. They were right that the oil embargo was a strategic threat. They were right that the American Pacific Fleet was the obstacle to the resource acquisition Japan needed. They were right that a surprise attack could disable that fleet temporarily. They were wrong about one thing, the thing that determined everything. They believed America would choose negotiation over a long war. America chose a long war. In that choice, Made by Roosevelt and by the American public in the weeks after Pearl Harbor, the outcome was decided, not in 4 years of island battles and submarine warfare and firebombing and atomic bombs. In the weeks of December 1941, when the question of whether to fight or accept what had happened was being settled in Washington, the answer was fight. From that answer, everything else followed, including the 2 bombs that the history books used to explain the surrender that the industrial analysis had made inevitable months before the bombs were built. Japan did not lose because of Hiroshima. Japan lost because of the decision made in Washington in December 1941 to fight a long war against a country that could not survive a long war. Hiroshima was the last page of a book whose ending had been written 4 years earlier. The book was written by a country that produced 12 times as much steel and 80 times as much oil. The words on the last page were just the final confirmation of a story that the numbers had been telling since before the first chapter began.